Hi, good evening, everybody. This is Dr. Vijay. On behalf of GCCMC, I would like to welcome each and all participants. This global coalition for COVID-19 medical care was an initiative and a thought process from Wipro Technologies. As an extended CSR activity, they wanted to do this so that they could bring all the medical fraternity under one roof where they can disseminate the curated knowledge. So through GCCMC platform, there are a lot of activities which is being happening. One of them is a webinar series. We also have learning modules which is happening for entry level doctors and junior doctors. We had a module on treatment of COVID cases. Then again, we had a module on COVID vaccines also. So this is our 10th webinar which is happening. This is a part 2 of the vaccine webinar which we had before. The part 1 was conducted even before the vaccines were launched for the general public. So it's the same eminent panel which we have today to discuss on the vaccine, what was the past, present and future. So I would welcome Dr. Abdul Ghafoor, who is an infectious disease specialist from Apollo Chennai, to take over, introduce the panel and start. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you, Dr. Vijay. Good evening. And thank you, GCCMC, for giving us this platform to discuss the very important issue of COVID vaccines. More than 130 million individuals in the world are tested positive for COVID, with more than 3 million deaths. In India alone, 13 million are tested positive with more than 160,000 deaths. A vaccine is the safest exit route out of the pandemic. At the global level, more than 700 million doses of vaccine are administered. India has administered more than 90 million doses of vaccine so far, within 3 months after the launch of our vaccination program on January 16th of this year. United States have administered 170 million, China 150 million, and India at the third position of 90 million. In fact, India is administering 3 to 4 million doses, every day, and is the fastest vaccination program in the world. India has also shipped or donated more than 60 million doses to other countries as a part of our Vaccine Maitri or the Vaccine Friendship Program. Unfortunately, at the global level, more than 70% of the vaccine doses were utilized by upper income or upper middle income countries, with the poorest countries receiving less than 0.1% of the doses. And now we are experiencing a massive second wave at the global level and in India, with the virus becoming smarter day by day by generation of variants of concern. At the same time, the global public becoming complacent as the pandemic progresses. We have 3 eminent experts here. Dr. Jacob John, we all know him, a globally renowned virologist. We have Dr. Anand Ban, he's a bioethics expert. And then we have got David Heinemann, he's a renowned epidemiologist and infectious disease specialist from UK. Dr. Jacob John will initiate the discussion. How significant are the variants of concern and what's their role in the massive second wave?
Thank you, Abdul Ghafoor, Dr. Vijay Abdul Ghafoor, and my friends. The scene of variants of the SARS coronavirus type 2 is a bewildering, disorienting scene, because things are happening so rapidly, so fast in very many places. Now, what is a variant? People used to call this strains. They are not strains. They are not, the genome of the virus is a single-stranded positive sense RNA. Positive sense means when the RNA gets inside the cell, it will straight away go into the protein manufacturing machinery, the ribosome, and like a ticker taper, it will keep on producing the proteins that the virus needs. Essentially, virus needs functional proteins and structural proteins, and we are interested in the structural proteins, which is the most important that we are concerned with is the spike glycoprotein. There is a small protein E, there is a matrix protein M, and there is a nucleocapsid protein N. We leave all that aside. We'll come to the spike protein. Of the entire length of the genome, which is 29,903 nucleosides. Okay, 30,000 nucleosides, less than 5%, 1,273 nucleosides are reserved for the spike protein. Now, the 1,273 spike protein nucleosides are divided into two parts, 1 to 541, no, 1 to 685, S1, 686 to 1273, S2, nested within the first part, 319 to 541. Don't worry about these numbers, are the receptor binding domain of the spike protein. Okay, and single-stranded RNA virus replication does not have a proofreader. So in the process of replicating, manufacturing the proteins, and the RNA itself, you have to replicate the RNA to package inside the virus. There will be minor errors. We call it error, but minor variations. And if the variation is too severe and the virus genome is completely messed up, that virus will not be born. But if the variation in the sequence are livable with, then you will have the virus coming out with a slightly different genomic structure. This is a very common thing in all single-stranded RNA viruses. However, measles and polio are single-stranded RNA viruses. They have cohabited with humans for many, many centuries. And therefore, all their variations have settled down to the most optimum genetic structure of poliovirus or measles virus, and there is no further variations either necessary for the virus's benefit or does occur because we have come up to an equilibrium. I would think that in the natural host of this virus, probably this coronavirus is quite stable genetically, hardly any more mutations going on. Whereas when you put this into a new host system, the virus is replicating at a tremendous pace, and you are throwing up these errors and these variants. Many of them die out. Many of them get packaged in the virus that come out. And if imagine a particular virus variant has an advantage in transmission, what will happen? That virus will infect more, and the multiplier effect will be that that virus will become very widely distributed. Just because that genetic variation, genetic mutation happen to be advantageous to the virus just for rapid transmission. If you remember, the founder variant was Wuhan WUHU1. That is the founder variant. Then pretty soon we realized that there was a small variation at position 614 of the spike protein, D to G. So D614G became a common variant, and it took over the entire global prevalence. So we don't see a Wuhan virus anymore. We only see D614G variant. And from then, because we have allowed the virus to multiply in all over the world, in every country, various countries inbreeding of the virus in their geographic location, certain variants predominate. So in September of 2020, a variant was detected in UK. In October of 2020, a variant was detected in South Africa. And in December 2020, a variant was detected, a Brazilian variant was detected in Japan, because the Brazilians, the travel to Brazil was the risk factor. And when they found where this variant was, it was in Brazil. So today we know these three as the variants of concern. Other variants are of some interest, scientific, or no interest. So the variants of concern are for three reasons. Is it more easily transmitted? If it is more easily transmitted, what happens is the R value, the reproduction number. Previously, one infected person could infect 2 people. Now, one infected person could infect 3 or 4 people. So that variant has a propensity to spread globally. And so the UK variant took over entire Europe very fast. And today in Punjab, majority of infections are the UK variant. So that is R value. The second worry or concern is whether the virulence has increased or not. The UK variant seemed to have higher virulence and higher morbidity and mortality. The third concern is that a lot of vaccines have been made, and the original Chinese vaccine was against Wuhan virus. Most of the rest of the vaccines have been using the D641G variant. The question is whether these new variants, will they be protected against by vaccines that we have been using? All the vaccines have their origins in 2020, somewhere in 2020. So they represent an older generation of variant. So that's the question. The CDC Atlanta recognizes 2 more variants of concern. We will not go into that. Now, the terminology of these variants are utterly confusing. There is a lineage nomenclature. For example, there is B1 lineage and P1 lineage. The Brazil is P1, UK and South Africa is B1. Okay, so then scientists who discovered them have given them names. These names are temporary. They may not last very long. Some changes will happen. So the UK variant is essentially known as UK variant. The name was 202012/01. It simply says the date on which it was recognized. The South African variant is called 501.Y.V2. The Brazilian variant is called P1. So even the nomenclature, the names given are also quite non-uniform. Eventually, uniformity will settle in, but not yet. The UK variant is more transmissible. Disease is more severe. The South African variant is more transmissible. Disease is not more severe, but vaccine effectiveness against certain vaccines is quite low. Certain vaccines do well, certain vaccines don't do well. For example, the AstraZeneca vaccine is virtually useless against the South African variant, whereas the Pfizer and Moderna are quite okay for South African variant. The Brazilian variant transmissibility is more, vaccine effectiveness is less, severity is probably the same as before. So these are the reasons why we call them variants of concern. Okay, how do we face this conundrum? As I said, some vaccines do very well so far for all variants. Some vaccines do not do for all variants, some variants. So a new idea that has come up is, if you use a vaccine with a new variant epitope or antigen as a booster, it's a different vaccine. So we call it a hetero booster. Will that booster magnify the immunity induced by the original antigen? In the influenza terminology, we call it the original antigenic sin. So whatever you do, the original immune response will be magnified, and the antigen that you gave, that you're interested in, will not have much of an effect. Will it happen? Or will the hetero booster be advantageous by broadening the immune response? So the Karolinska group has done one such experiment by giving I think the South African RBD, receptor binding region, as a soluble protein vaccine, adjuvanted, boosted people who had the original Wuhan variant vaccine. And lo and behold, the boosting effect was very broadly reacting, both against the original and against the virus from which that antigen was derived. So there is a lot of hope that by mixing and matching vaccines, we may be able to overcome, to a very large extent, the concern about vaccine escape. I will close with one more idea or a problem. Many people, or not many people, some experts are now getting worried that if you have a lot of virus transmission, at the same time a lot of vaccine being distributed, a lot of people are getting infected in spite of one dose of vaccine, even with the second dose of vaccine before immunity kicks in, and the virus that is multiplying inside the body have now immunity pressure. Therefore, any mutant that has some replication advantage overcoming the immunity already made, what we call vaccine escape mutants will grow, will transmit, and will spread. So, by inadequate vaccination to prevent infection on a large scale. For example, if you give the vaccine to protect from severe disease and death, will we be doing more harm in the overall to the whole community of people by allowing vaccine escape mutants coming up? That's a big question, and we do not have the answer, but my own personal view, I'm saying it especially for David's listening, I'm convinced that the world must get together to eradicate, or at least attempt to eradicate, this coronavirus. If we do that, if we aim at the stars, we may reach the treetop. So we may be able to control the coronavirus very well, maximally, if you aim at eradication, and we may even be able to eradicate this virus. Okay, I will stop there, and thank you very much for patient listening.
Thanks a lot, sir. A maestro always makes complicated things simple, and you did that very well. All of us have been reading a lot about highly confusing and complicated terminology and importance of variants, and you made it very simple. Now at least we know how to proceed further. We will have a lot of questions during the question and answer discussion session. Now we'll move on to Dr. Anand Ban. Dr. Ban, welcome.
Thank you, Abdul. Thank you for having me.
Dr. Ban, we have a serious problem of equitable distribution of vaccine. More than 70% of the vaccine utilized around the world have been utilized by countries with less than 16% of the population. More than 18% of the vaccine have been utilized by rich and upper middle income countries, and poor countries have got only 0.1% of the vaccine. India has been lucky to have our own companies manufacturing vaccine, so we are doing a good job. But at global level, equity is a serious problem. So what is your opinion about this lack of equitable distribution at global level, and how can we resolve this?
Thank you, Abdul. So I think, this question relates to one of the fundamental sort of global health dilemmas that we have, I think, and maybe an emblematic issue all through last year, and certainly much more this year now that vaccines are available, which is that why is there such a huge inequity between nations around vaccines? As Professor John was talking about, this is a pandemic. It impacts all parts of the world. And hence, any response will need to factor in the fact that if anyone is at risk, everyone is at risk. And no one country, by trying to approach vaccination and trying to think that it will protect its own population, will necessarily be able to free itself of the virus. In fact, now we have enough evidence to indicate that there is a possibility of reinfection. Now we also know that vaccines might not necessarily prevent against infection. They might prevent against serious disease or death. So if that is the case, by hoarding vaccines, by over-ordering vaccines at the peril or at the cost of other countries, I think many countries have probably gone short-sighted in the way they have approached this. And this raises difficult questions globally of organizations in the multilateral space like WHO, even though they have made efforts and they've also recognized, I think the WHO DG has gone on record and talked about the fact that this is something to worry about. But the fact we don't have an international mechanism which can help ensure equity in the distribution of not just vaccines, but tomorrow if there are issues around diagnostics, if there are issues around therapeutics, etc., this same issue is something that we will need to worry about. In fact, India has been lucky, as you said, on the vaccine side, but also lucky on the PPE side. If you remember, when we started off in the pandemic, we were importing a large component of our PPE, and only by virtue of getting many of our domestic manufacturing to focus on PPE and masks, etc., we managed to now reach self-sufficiency. In fact, now I think we import, we are easily able to export some of that. Now, that is not something which is possible for many low and middle income countries. In fact, the worrisome part is that there are countries where you might sometimes have situations where they might have 4 or 5 or 6 doses of vaccine available per citizen, and there are other countries which don't even have a minuscule amount of vaccine to cover the needs of frontline health workers who are critical to the health system in the response. And there are still countries in the world where hardly any vaccine has reached, unless you had a small donation by mechanisms of COVAX or by outreach by countries like India, which have also donated to some countries. But clearly, that's never going to be enough. So the fact that you now have situations where you are dependent either on donations or waiting your turn in COVAX to get something out of that platform is something which is deeply worrisome, because at the end of the day, if we are going to have pockets of infection which are going to sustain, then we will not be able to effectively deal with the pandemic. In fact, we need to have a global response which recognizes the interdependence. The only reason we have seen such a rapid spread of this infection is because we are also connected. The travel has been a major factor in the way this infection spread, right from its origin all the way across the world, and that is never going to cease. That risk will always remain. So by being short-sighted about it and by not being sensitive and supportive of providing vaccines equitably, I think there has been certainly a moral failure in global health. Now, what can change about that requires quite a few things. One, there's certainly a need for more manufacturing capacity in LMICs. But I think it's also important for us in the low and middle income countries to do more R&D, which is because if you don't do enough R&D, then you're still dependent on licensing mechanisms. For example, as you know, Serum Institute has primarily licensed the vaccine from AstraZeneca. And over the last couple of days, we've heard about the fact that AstraZeneca might be, filing a court case or suing Serum Institute for not delivering on its promise to COVAX or not delivering on its promise to the UK government. And that is because, again, the primary rights to the vaccine lie with AstraZeneca. Now, if we were to have more LMIC R&D happening, where the vaccine is also developed in these countries, and you also have manufacturing capacity like we have in India, which can be leveraged, and I think we should be able to see more South-to-South cooperation. But that will require leadership from countries like India. Now, as we know, many of the countries in the fray right now, which have vaccines which are cheaper, are India, China, Russia, and those vaccine rollout politics in a way are playing out already in between these countries. But now also we have to recognize that in India, with the rising number of cases, there is also a lot of pressure on the government to restrict exports and to focus on domestic need and domestic consumption. And I think that's also going to be a challenge to deal with. Now, it's important, I think, even at this point of time, for India to gain leadership and show that it's possible to deal with domestic need and yet also recognize its role as an important, front runner in being supportive of providing vaccines to other countries. And I think that's where we've already seen some good movement from India. We've also seen a lot of export happen from India, sometimes by nature of grants and not necessarily sale to other countries. And hopefully more of that can happen as there are more vaccines in the fray. So, our vaccine companies, both which are already manufacturing and are licensed, as well as the companies which are now doing clinical trials, I think they will have an important role to play. But we certainly need more support from our own governments to ensure that we have high quality science happening, good quality regulatory oversight structures, and then also linkages so that academia, a lot of academic research happens, but then is also linked to being able to manufacture, do industrial production, and be able to actually produce vaccines for the world. If we were to depend on many of the MNCs, then it's going to be extremely difficult. Even now, I think there is a lot of demand, for example, within India to talk about why don't we get the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine in here. And yes, it could play a role, but we have to recognize that those vaccines are fairly much more costly and are not going to be accessible. That is the other equity issue, that if we were to have situations where you import some of these kinds of vaccines, which are much more costly, and then you have relatively cheaper vaccines, then will we have a two-tier system where those who are rich have access to a Pfizer or a Moderna vaccine, and those who are not can only wait for their turn in the government system, or maybe scrounge the 250 to 500 rupees to try to get a Covishield or a Covaxin? And is that also something that is acceptable? Or should we have some price regulation in a way that your ability to pay does not impact your ability to be able to access a good quality standard vaccine? Those are the kind of conversations I think we'll have to see. So as more and more vaccines come in the fray, I think it might also throw out some interesting and difficult questions, including around what is the role of the government? Do we need to have price regulation? How do we ensure that vaccines are equitably available? Also, earlier, I think there was a lot of probably vaccine uptake happening in urban areas and by the middle class. Maybe it's an information equity issue. But now that we see a lot of spread of infection even in rural areas, we also have to ensure that while we are seeing a situation where in some urban centers there is a shortage of vaccines, there is still a situation in some rural areas, in some tribal areas where not enough vaccine is being probably effectively utilized. So how do we address that from an information perspective is also going to be important. So absolutely, I think this is an important question for all of us to deal with, but certainly also something which should be a pressing issue for global health to be addressed as well. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Ban, for your valuable inputs. We will have a lot to discuss on this important topic during our Q&A session. And now we will have Dr. David Heinemann, who is a very eminent infectious disease epidemiologist and a policy maker at global level. And Dr. David Heinemann will update us on what's the global status on the COVID vaccination, and most importantly, the WHO COVAX, the role of WHO COVAX in maintaining the equitable distribution of vaccine. David?
Thanks very much, Abdul. And thanks, Dr. Ban and Jacob also, because you said some things that are very important. I think that what we have to understand now is that COVID-19 is now endemic. And I think there's nobody that thinks that it's not endemic, at least in the near future, and probably long-term, like the 4 other endemic human coronaviruses. So we must live with this virus, and we've also learned that this virus can infect animals and become endemic in animals, as it did in minks. And minks were able to be infected, to transmit from one to another, and also transmit back to humans, which would make any attempt, Jacob, at eradicating this, as we know, very difficult because of the fact that animals now are also carrying this virus. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have that aspirational target to get as high a vaccination coverage as we can in order to see if we can't really control this disease in a much better way than we're doing. You know, we've got 2 examples in the past of how getting equitable access to vaccines can do a lot for infectious diseases. We've seen smallpox eradicated. We've seen polio almost eradicated with equitable access to vaccines in both of those issues. We're also seeing the same happen with measles, with other diseases, but not as intensive as it has been with polio and with smallpox. We've also seen that influenza vaccine now is being made available during pandemics by manufacturers who are willing to donate 10% of their production, and in addition then give WHO a special price for the next 10% of the vaccine that they produce, so that developing country essential workers can be vaccinated. So we're gradually making a progression towards more equitable distribution of vaccines. And then in this pandemic, we've seen the ACT Accelerator be developed, which has the COVAX facility for vaccines, which also has a facility to get diagnostic tests and to get therapeutics out to the people who need them. And let's focus on COVAX, because it's really a unique idea. The idea is that industrialized countries could purchase up to 50% of their vaccine needs through COVAX. And at the same time, the COVAX facility would provide to those lesser developed countries that don't have the funding to procure a vaccine, 20% of their requirement, feeling that that would be what was needed for the essential workers in their countries. So this is the concept that if all of these groups came together, industrialized countries, lower income countries as well, came together to procure vaccine through the COVAX facility, there could be a way of decreasing the price of that vaccine for everyone. That was the concept on which this was set up with three partners: WHO, the CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, and Gavi. And they're working together now to make vaccines available. And as you know, some countries have now benefited from contributions of vaccine from the COVAX facility. But it hasn't worked the way that people had hoped it would work, because industrialized countries have not been willing to purchase vaccines through that facility. They want to do their own bilateral arrangements with industry. And as a result, we see now that there's not so much a problem of money for the COVAX facility as much as a problem of production, of getting vaccines that they can purchase. And so what Dr. Bond said is really very important, that countries should be developing their own capacities to develop vaccine, and maybe even be developing their own vaccines, because the skills in India, in other countries, are important skills in developing, not just in licensing and producing, but in developing their own vaccines. So I think that to overcome these production problems, Dr. Bond was exactly on target, that we need really to make sure that developing countries are not just producing vaccines, but are doing the research and development of vaccines, as has China, as has Russia, which are not necessarily developing countries, but as India could be doing as well and has not yet done. And I would hope that a meeting such as this can stimulate that interest, so that the regulatory agencies and the other groups within India that are necessary to develop vaccines could be developing their own vaccines and using them both nationally, and then getting the pre-qualification necessary to sell them globally. So just to say that the COVAX facility is a step forward after we've seen how important equitable access is for vaccines, for drugs, and for diagnostic tests. And we need to make sure that it doesn't fail. And I think as time goes on, countries will be providing more funding to COVAX facility, and vaccine manufacturers will be able to meet the need. So Abdul, I'll stop at that. I just wanted to give a short introduction. I think absolutely Jacob John's idea of high aspirations is very important. Let's get as many people vaccinated as possible. And Dr. Bond's aspiration of getting research and development to develop vaccines and produce them nationally are two very important issues to discuss. So thanks, Abdul, and back to you.
Thanks, David, for your valuable comments. I think you have discussed a very important point, as Dr. John and Dr. Bond have done. Most countries, there are many countries who have the capability to manufacture the vaccine and to develop the vaccine. And India is one among those countries. And we are making a significant contribution to the global COVID vaccination program. We have two companies already, the Serum Institute of India, who is manufacturing the Oxford vaccine, and Bharat Biotech manufacturing Covaxin, which is actually an indigenous and an Indian vaccine. And we have multiple other companies like Zydus Cadila developing their own vaccine. But definitely we can do a lot more. And Dr. John, what do you think about the Indian vaccines, our own capacity to not just manufacture, but develop our own vaccines and give it to the rest of the world? You have to unmute your mic, sir. You have to unmute your mic.
Yeah. Okay. Automatic muting. Am I audible now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. If you had listened to David Heyman very carefully, he said India could have done original research. Okay, the point is well taken, David. The Indian vaccine, the so-called Indian vaccine, one Indian vaccine is the inactivated virus vaccine. And let me tell you, that is world-class inactivated virus vaccine, the best you can make with the best adjuvant, but it is still the early 20th century technology. We have not invested money in any modern scientific technology to create a multiplicity of new approaches for vaccine. So we missed the boat. But keep that aside. We even were not visionary enough for risk funding vaccine. Risk funding is the companies are willing to put their own money, but they will only go this far. They will not manufacture 100 million doses. Because if you don't sell it, you lose a lot of money. So that kind of a buffer, 100 million doses for India is a small amount. If that was ensured in the very early phase of the vaccine journey of companies, we would probably have 200 million doses already. But that was not done. Call it risk funding or advance purchase contract, or simply putting your money down for investment so that if there's any loss, the company doesn't have to absorb it by itself. Okay, so we could have done better, and we need to promote science, basic science, that is science of curiosity, of understanding the biology of viruses, and many other fields, so that we don't confine our science to merely technology and product-based research. You want a vaccine, you want a diagnostic, you do research. Or you want to send a rocket up, so you have your technology. That is not science. Science is basically, fundamentally investing money in intellectual ideas, and out of which will come intellectual property, and then money will come back. Thank you.
Thanks, sir. Dr. Bond, what is your opinion? Our country can do a lot more for the development of vaccine and not just manufacturing. And how can we inspire that development? And who should do that? Who should kickstart that process?
Yeah, we should certainly kickstart it. I don't think we can say that we have not done it, but as Professor John is rightly pointing out, we certainly need to do much more. I think, the rotavirus vaccine development process was a good one. I think there's a lot of experience to be leveraged from that. That having been said, we are a large country with multiple public health problems, and we know that we have good quality manufacturing. We have fairly good private companies largely. But we have to recognize that our pipeline for that manufacturing requires quality investment in R&D, which means that you need to have the scientists, you need to have the institutions, you need to have the thinking, you need to have the long-term support. COVID is an exception in the way vaccine development has happened. It's literally taken less than a year for some of these vaccines to go through multiple stages of R&D. But there's still a lot of work required. We need a good quality TB vaccine. We need a better quality malaria vaccine. We need vaccine for multiple other conditions. Either if there is a vaccine, we need a better one, or we don't have any vaccine at all. HIV is a good example as well, where we're still waiting to have a vaccine. So there's a lot of vaccinology to be done, but that requires consistent support. We need to have institutions of excellence which focus on this. We don't have many of those. We have individual institutions or individual scientists who are very interested in this domain and who have been at it despite sometimes adverse environment, and have managed to make us all feel proud. But this, requires a much more consistent approach, and that requires an enabling environment. Our regulatory structures, I think, are also some things that we need to question sometimes. I don't think we have standard regulatory approaches. Sometimes the oversight can be lax, sometimes it is non-existent, at other times it is questionable. In other cases, we don't have enough details around what other approaches used. A good quality regulator will also be very helpful, because not just do we want to do more science in the vaccine space, we also want to do it in a way that it is globally respected, so that any vaccine which is developed in India would also be respected automatically. And we should be aiming for the highest standards that exist, and for WHO pre-qualification for every vaccine that we come up with, so that it can be used across the world. And not just for the vaccines we manufacture, but also the vaccines where we have done early stage research. And certainly India has the right environment to be able to push that, but that will require our governments to invest in it. It will require us to partner with industry as well, and that requires, there are conflicts of interest there, but not unsurmountable. These are conflicts which can be addressed, but you need to have transparency, you need to have accountability, you need to have governance, and you need to have again support from, so there is the DBT in India, there's ICMR in India. We need to see a coherent strategy, that learning, especially so from this pandemic, how are we going to do vaccinology better in this country? And hopefully the lessons are right there, and senior experts like Professor John are there as well to guide some of that knowledge.
Dr. David Heinemann. David?
Yes.
India and South Africa tried to get a motion passed at the World Trade Organization with the help of several other countries to waive off the IP rights on COVID vaccines until the pandemic, the peak of the pandemic is over. Unfortunately, that did not happen. What is your view on waiving of the IP rights of COVID vaccines during pandemic?
Well, unfortunately, there's nothing that has yet replaced intellectual property as far as creating ingenuity in the private sector. The private sector has been where the majority of our vaccines and other interventions have come from. And IP has been the way that companies have said that they regain their investment in this activity. I think what Jacob said earlier, that governments investing in early on in guaranteeing a market, or even in providing stimulus funding to companies, taking the risk with that funding, is one way of making sure that the intellectual property then belongs to the country rather than to the company. And I think this is a way of proceeding that could be very important in the future. I think going to the World Trade Organization is also very important, but there already is an article in the World Trade Organization about compulsory licensing when there is a need for public health intervention. And I'm not sure if India has tried to approach the World Trade Organization through that objective, or have they tried to approach it in a different way? I'm not clear how they've tried to approach it. But until we can make sure that there is money that's provided to take the risk off the private sector and let them still make some kind of a profit from what they produce while giving a public sector guarantee as well, I think is the only way we can move forward now, because of the fact that we haven't been able to replace IP with anything else. There's been the patent pool, there have been other attempts, but these have not yet taken off fully. But maybe you could explain, Jacob, or Abdul, what was attempted at the World Trade Organization?
Yeah, at WTO, the motion was for the IP rights waiver during the pandemic and not for compulsory licensing. And India, of course, we did not have to think about compulsory licensing at all, because both our companies were willing to provide vaccines to our people at a very, very low cost. So currently, we don't even have to think about the compulsory licensing issues, because both companies are cooperating with the government and the public in a great way, I have to say. And Dr. John, what is your opinion about this IP issue and the cost of the vaccines?
Well, let me not, go further into this kind of a economic, partly philosophical, partly economic idea of pushing on intellectual property. United States became a rich country partly on intellectual property. Almost every other thing that we buy, we pay a few cents to United States. So intellectual property is actually far better investment than agricultural produce. There are so many other things. So India has not understood it. Culturally, we are improvisers and imitators. improvisers and imitators never become innovators. So you need a new way of an urge to innovate, and other than money up as a carrot, I do not know what will attract innovation. So I'm stuck. Thank you very much.
Dr. Ban, what is your viewpoint on this IP rights and compulsory licensing of the COVID vaccines? It's becoming very controversial now.
Yeah, so I mean, again, one has to recognize the importance of innovation, and one has to recognize there is a role for intellectual property. That having been said, in this pandemic, we have seen situations where there are global inequities, and patents is part of the problem. Now, is a waiver of patents the way to go? Maybe it has to be one of the cards on the table. But even if we argue that, let's waive patents, it's not going to be enough, because unless you do tech transfers or technical know-how is also transferred, you will not be able to overnight produce vaccines in LMICs. It's not the case that just because if a company agrees to waive off patents or is forced to waive off patents, that suddenly next day you'll be able to produce vaccine in another country. You need to, especially for, say, the mRNA vaccines, etc., you will need a lot of hand-holding to be able to actually manufacture vaccines of decent quality. So we need to then talk about, well, if there is a problem, what is the solution? And are the existing platforms like WTO able to solve this vexing issue? Or, are we just going to have long discussions which don't lead to any kind of response? There are very few countries which have been able to leverage compulsory licensing, though it's been around for many years now. But I think many countries are also reluctant, even I guess courts are reluctant to get into that space. Because I guess there is a concern about overreach, etc. But if there is going to be a situation where countries feel that they're not having any access to an intervention like a vaccine or a diagnostic or a therapeutic, then it's likely that they might start exploring this. This is allowed, as Professor Heyman was saying, under under the WTO and TRIPS agreements. But I think we also need to talk about what needs to be done differently, and if the intellectual property regime as it exists today has some gray areas, has some concerns, especially for the global south, then what needs to be changed, and when do we do it? There has to be some urgency. If we keep postponing this discussion, I think this is what will happen. But the other issue is also a lot of decision making still, including in international fora, WTO, UN, it largely lies with globally rich countries. So even if you make these efforts, as India and South Africa have done, they will not go through unless there is support from the global north. And that is going to be highly unlikely, because a lot of multinationals are based in these countries. And there's a lot of pressure, obviously, on the politicians to not allow it. So again, I think we're going to be in that difficult circumstance for a long time, but we have to recognize that there is a problem. And what the systems we have right now, I'm not so sure are able to deal with this in an effective way.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
Thanks, Dr. Ban.
Abdul, I might just add that I think WHO had some kind of a commission a while back trying to see if there was a way to replace intellectual property. And they came out with several recommendations, but as Dr. Ban said, they never really were able to solve this issue completely. And it's something that people have to continue to work on, because it's not an easy solution. But I don't think it can happen if industry is being excluded from the discussions. They have to be sitting with the discussions, and there have to be figuring out ways of doing it. But I think it has to be pursued by countries like India to the utmost.
I have to go back.
Thanks, David. That's a very important suggestion, where policymakers, especially countries like India and South Africa, needs to consider. And this is something we need to push on, at the same time respecting intellectual property rights, but we need to have an alternative mechanism to ensure equitable distribution. And that's a very valid point. Thanks, David. We have an interesting question here. We are facing a massive second wave in India, like in many other countries. Now, Dr. John, regarding our Indian variant, the 617, B1617, do you think that is the reason behind the big second wave in India? Or is it because we are not following the COVID protocol? The public is not following the following the COVID protocol? Is the virus at fault or the public at fault?
You know, all pandemics. 100 years ago, there was a influenza pandemic. Respiratory transmitted pandemic, other than influenza, this is the first time we are facing it. It has come in waves. 2 waves, 3 waves, not uncommon. Many European countries showed that they had second wave. South Korea had second wave. So second wave has been a phenomenon in many countries. My own prediction was that India would not have a second wave, because we had this huge mountain of the first wave. But I was wrong. The second wave, I think, has 3 factors. One is the inherent property of the after wave of a major wave, which is a phenomenon in all respiratory transmitted pandemics. So it is the given. I had not actually thought through that and predicted that. I was hoping that, partly wishful thinking, that it wouldn't happen. Secondly, the variant that you mentioned today is a December 20 vintage variant. It's not a new variant. We were not watching out for variants. So as variants came with higher R value than the earlier variants, was the time to tighten up our discipline and our non-pharmacological interventions. At that specific time, we let our guard down. Central government, many state governments, Kumbh Mela, elections, and I see weddings and all kinds of things, funerals, wherein absolutely no discipline is maintained by people. Hardly anybody wears a mask any longer. Shops are open. So it is a combination of, at the wrong time, we let our guard down. And as we let our guard down, new variants took over. And the so-called UK variant is predominant in Punjab. The Maharashtra is probably the new variant that you mentioned. So I think it's a combination of these 3 factors. A phenomenology of respiratory transmitted pandemic to come back as a wave, like, if you throw a big stone in a lake, you will see the first wave followed by second and third wave. Secondly, we let our guard down too soon, and we didn't apply our social vaccine concept, and we let people, for various reasons, partly political, partly people were tired, partly people did not know the reality, partly people thought the vaccine is arrived, so we don't have to worry anything about it. And that, it's a combination of these 3 factors have made the second wave. But if you see the second wave shape, you can see that the speed of spread is so rapid. I calculated the the doubling time. What was 1 month in the first wave is 10 days in the second wave. So it is 3 times as fast spreading as previously. And at the same time, we lost our the non-pharmacological discipline of preventing or reducing the transmission. So all this together, we have the second wave. My prediction is that the second wave will peak in April and will come down in May and June. And by June, we will have back to the endemic phase that David was talking about, 20,000 a day. This is a short, sharp, high peak second wave.
Dr. John's prediction about the first wave was perfectly right. It went down as he predicted. And let's all hope that's exactly going to happen with the second wave as well. It's going to be a short, sharp wave. And sir, do you think this short doubling time or 3 times the transmission, is that because the virus is more transmissible, or we let down the guard 3 times less? Which one to blame more?
I think both. to be fair to the reality, I think it is both. Both with the conjunction in time, both came together simultaneously.
Okay. Dr. Ban, what do you think? From a clinical perspective, we are more relaxed now during the second wave. We know how to manage COVID far better than the first wave. From a public health perspective, still a massive second wave is a massive second wave. And what do you think about the reasons and how we can cope with this second wave?
Yeah, I mean, one has to recognize that there's a lot of learning from the experience in 2020 of dealing with the pandemic. But the issue is, have our policymakers learned the lessons? Now, the answer is maybe yes in some ways. So I think they have been a bit more circumspect in going ahead with steps like lockdown, especially when it's en masse lockdown across the country or across the state. They've been reluctant to go down that route because they saw that there were a lot of downsides to that. But yet at the same time, they've also been, reluctant to go ahead and address some of the events which are causes for concern. Whether those be religious in nature, whether those be political in nature. This has been election season, and we have to recognize that there's been some poor role modeling by politicians and political parties in the way these events have gone out, and they've criticized other events, but not yet talked about their own responsibility in that. So that is something to worry about. The second thing is there's been, for example, on the human resource side, last year there was a lot of recruitment of short-term staff, but to try to address the pandemic response, whether for contact tracing, whether for helping man some of the facilities, the COVID care centers, etc., which were set up. But then all of these centers were very quickly dismantled and the staff was let go. And that again is now becoming a reason for concern because we don't have enough staff available in some states to deal with the increasing case count. So that just tells us that from a policy perspective, one would have thought that they would have learned the lesson that you need to have more human resources in health, you need more health allotment, and you need to have a resilient health system with enough backup so that if there is a second rise of the kind we are seeing now, that you're able to manage that and yet prevent a negative fallout of that on routine non-COVID care. Now, what is happening now is that there is again an inordinate focus on COVID in many states at the cost of non-COVID care. It's again a situation where elective surgeries are being cancelled, cancer care, chronic care is being impacted, routine immunization. There is already in some states an impact probably happening because now we're talking about 24/7 vaccination. We're talking about more and more vaccinators being pushed on COVID-19 duty. So imagine what impact will that have in the absence of adequate human resourcing being added on. And that is what I worry about, that, if we have learned these lessons last year, but, it didn't really matter or register, we were all looking at for the short-term solutions, then, what does that tell us about what we learned from the pandemics? And isn't there a need for us to also reflect on why is the learning from last year not really being thought through? On the clinical side also, I think there's still causes for concern. I mean, for a lot of the interventions on the clinical side, there is now enough global evidence which indicates either poor evidence or lack of evidence. But still, even now, if you see WhatsApp groups, you will see all kinds of medicines and combinations being used, which are not necessarily evidence-based. Now, there is obviously the role for clinical discretion, but you can't throw evidence out of the window. I think we are much better managing at the clinical level cases of COVID-19, but I think one has to also recognize that our clinicians and the way we do evidence-based medicine also needs to be interrogated in some way. And maybe that's another area for the medical profession specifically to look inward and try to figure out how can we do things better in the way that patients are not exploited and we focus on the good quality care that we are all very much interested in.
We got a very interesting question from Dr. Radha Rangarajan, who is an entrepreneur scientist. India needs to be studying new variants of the virus to understand how effective current vaccines are going to be. Why is more research not happening? Dr. John, you are the right question to answer. We need to study the variants more, and that's not happening. What can we do?
It's a very generic or systemic problem in the country. I use the word imitators and improvisers. We were not looking for variants, because although we knew from day one that this is positive strand, single strand RNA virus, and mutations will be very common, we only very recently established a consortium of 10 genome laboratories under the leadership of NCDC, with ICMR and various others participating, to go into the genomic studies to find variants and what the variants are doing. And that program has not taken off yet. And it is that program that unearths the presence of the UK and South Africa and Brazil variants in India, and come up with new variants that had not been recognized previously. So we need to let universities, people who are, how many virologists are there who had an MD degree, medical or pediatrics, and then went into virology? I'm the only one. I cannot see a single other person who has developed a clinical virology specialty. All the other virologists are microbiology virologists or biotechnology virologists. What I'm saying is, we don't have a milieu in Indian scenario for going into, fun, exploratory, curiosity-based, idea-based research. And if you don't build that foundation, you will not find excellent ideas being tested out, mRNA, for example. So we do need to invest far more from basic school education, university education, and universities must be doing first-class research. How many medical colleges do research? You know that. It's a scandal that our medical colleges don't do research. There are maybe 12 medical colleges will produce 99% of the research that medical colleges do. Okay, so we have a big problem, and it's a fundamental problem that only unless government comes up with new policies and if they understand. And let me also tell you that medical doctors advising the government do not necessarily see the reality. We don't have a public health department like the Public Health England or the Public Health Service in the United States or the Public Health in Sri Lanka or in Thailand. Healthcare, we think, will cover everything. So we do have some fundamental problems. I don't have a solution. Unless people like you and me get together and develop new thought processes and then lobby with the government.
So Dr. John's point is very, very valid. When we talk about inadequate sequencing of the COVID virus, the problem lies much deeper. So if you need a solution for this, we need to look into a broader, basic perspective. So UK, Dr. Heinemann, and UK did a good job in sequencing. Probably your country sequences more number of samples than any other country, and that's why you succeeded in identifying the UK variant. How could you convince your government that sequencing is so important in pandemic control? What was your strategy?
Yeah, there's been a group that's for a long time been talking about.
I'm in a meeting. Can you call half an hour later?
There's been a group that's been discussing for quite a while now how to make the transformation into genetic sequencing for diagnosis of simple infections, to move ahead with this. And that's been supported by the Wellcome Trust, which the UK is fortunate to have. It's one of the major funders of research in the world. And in addition, the government has seen an interest in putting money into genetics as well. And so, as you know, there's the genetic sequencing facility that's been set up outside of Cambridge. And that facility is now sequencing on a regular basis, as well as a new facility in London, which is also to be looking at the epidemiology and sequences. So all of that has required both private foundation funding and government funding. And I'm sure that there are foundations in India, especially in some of the private companies, that could be tapped to do the same type of thing, to support a group that's thinking about how to move genetic sequencing forward as a diagnostic tool within India. And India, as you all will know, has been one of the 4 centers that's been doing the genetic sequencing for polio eradication program since the very beginning. So the skills are in India. What's lacking in India right now is that organization, and possibly, as Jacob said, the lobbying, to get the government to understand that you can contribute tremendously by investing in genomics institutions, such as has China, such as has done the UK. The US is actually behind those 2 countries, but they're also now investing in genomics institutions. So that's the way forward, is what Jacob said, I think is right. Get the vision and get the lobbying going with your government, and get the funding maybe from some of the private foundations to really help you move this ahead, because it's vital. You know, countries are actually leapfrogging over routine diagnostic tests, going directly to sequencing. For example, in Ebola outbreaks in Africa, the Nanopore, a handheld genetic sequencer, is a basic tool now in understanding about the contact tracing and the origins of outbreaks. So extremely important that India begin to develop its own National Genomics Institute's framework so that you can all be working together on this.
Yeah, it's a very valid point, because India did a very good job. Dr. John will know much better than me. India did a very good job in sequencing the polio virus. We should replicate that with COVID and other viruses. We have the ability, but we need to convince the policymakers and invest in sequencing.
Do you know that that lab is closed?
Which was that lab, sir?
The polio lab in Mumbai has been shifted to Pune, and that is kind of almost dismantled.
Okay.
So that is the way the job is done. Polio is over, finished. There is no more need for a lab.
Dr. John has opened an important point. We had, like shifting the government laboratory, we have 3 wonderful vaccine producing companies under the government: the Kasoli Institute, the Pasteur Institute, and our Guindy's BCG Institute. But you know, these institutions can do a lot more work and manufacture vaccines at massive scale if we support them. And what do you think about supporting such institutions under government funding and to help the country and the world?
Well, again, the motivation of job satisfaction plus money, profit, or intellectual, what shall I say, satisfaction of doing well, that is very unlikely to happen in government institutions. And so these government institutions, at one time doing fantastic work, slowly began regressing. And before they died, they were killed. They were closed. All 3 were closed. So we have to depend upon somebody else for BCG, somebody else for our PPD, private companies for even the DPT vaccine. So this Pasteur Institute is not doing well. The King Institute is closed, and we have not been able to create a new facility in Chengalpet. Although there is huge investment, huge 400 acres of land, big buildings, but we cannot find people to come and work there. So there is something, you take Indians and put them in UK or USA, they will flourish. But the system in India seems to be not the right atmosphere for intellectual curiosity pursuit.
Dr. Ban, what do you think about this point? Why can't we help our own big vaccine firms under the government, you know, to go back to their old days of glory and help us? Should government invest more in vaccine development and manufacturing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there is certainly a role for the private sector, and I see, you know, we have already seen that play out very positively in the way Serum, Shanta, Bharat Biotech, and other manufacturing companies help produce vaccines for a large section of the world. But as you were alluding to, there's been also a story of systemic neglect of our government vaccine producing units, and this did not happen overnight, as Professor John said. You know, it's not like there was one-time issue. This is just there was a lack of attention. Maybe there was complicity as well of some kind in terms of favoring the private sector. But this kind of decay doesn't happen overnight. It just shows that you have not paid attention to ensuring quality standards. You've not ensured that there is good quality support and leadership at these institutions. That having been said, it doesn't mean that we cannot revive these institutions. But often our politicians like to do fancy announcements, which is to say that we will restart things or we will open a new plant, etc. But then that is not going to be enough. You need to have a sustained effort to ensure that these become world quality institutions. I mean, if we want to come up with mediocre institutions, it's not going to help. If we really want to hit at being a major power in the science space and the R&D space and in the vaccine space, then let's try to aim for the best. And if part of that is ensuring that we have good quality centers in the public sector, then we have to support them in that journey by investing in them and ensuring that we have good quality leadership and a lack of political interference, which is to say that you need to have certainly high quality manpower and a strong vision which thinks about what is it that is a priority for these set of institutions and what is the kind of expectations and how do we support them. So that I think could be, for example, under the Principal Scientific Advisor's Office, and saying that you have a dedicated office support, you have dedicated funding, and this is the vision that we want to see, that these are revived and then that they have a clear goal ahead of them, which is to maybe come up with 5 vaccines of public health relevance to India over the next 10 years, 12 years, 10, 15 years, and then have a roadmap to get there. Otherwise, we should not be just doing things for the sake of doing things. I think I would rather see good quality investment with a clear idea on outcomes now. And that metric should apply even to the public sector.
India needs a master plan for vaccine development, manufacturing and development under the Prime Minister's office. As you mentioned, by the Principal Scientific Advisors, and the leadership, and under the leadership of PMO, it's something that our country definitely needs. We have got a very, very specific vaccinology question. As Sputnik 5 uses 2 different adenovirus for its 2 doses, will a booster dose with Sputnik 5 be a choice of those who already completed Covishield doses? So we have received 2 doses of Covishield. Now, should we get a booster with Sputnik 5? Dr. John, what do you think? As booster with Sputnik 5?
My simple answer is yes. And it is being investigated in different countries, USA and UK.
But will the Sputnik 5 cover new variants?
Pardon?
Will the Sputnik 5 cover new variants?
Okay. That is a different question. If you boost the immunity levels very high, you have a tendency to broaden your immune coverage. So to a large extent, yes. But if it will protect against variants like South Africa variant, we'll have to actually test and find out. Okay, we'll have to test and find out. However, olden days, if you started with one particular vaccine, discipline called for continuing with that product. You don't switch horses midstream. But this particular virus is showing us that if the virus can mutate so fast, we should be able to use our ingenuity and not stick with the rules, but do what is right. And hetero boosting, as I said earlier, is a good idea, and we don't have the original antigenic sin to worry about. So boosted immunity with a hetero antigen. Of course, the Sputnik and the AstraZeneca make more or less the same spike protein, or the DNA for the same spike protein. So I do not know how much of hetero boosting there will be. It will be probably a boosting of the same spike protein. But still, if you can boost your height of immune response, both antibody and CMI, you probably will have much superior protection against even variants.
The important point and concept, sir. So we got another interesting question for Dr. Radha. Are we testing more and so our numbers are higher in the second wave? Is that the reason why we are having more number of cases second wave? So we are testing more than the first wave?
You should be able to answer that better. I've not been watching how many we are testing and what with purpose. No, not at all.
Dr. Ban, what do you think?
Sorry, can you repeat the question, Abdul?
The number of cases are more in the second wave. Is that because we are testing more than the first wave?
I'm not so sure. I think testing is certainly a factor, but I don't think testing is as democratically spread out as was the case last year as well. I think some states are certainly testing more. Maharashtra is a good example. And I think we need to, I mean, as the Prime Minister, I think, was alluding yesterday in his meeting with the chief ministers, we need to test more. If we don't test, we will not be able to identify. And again, you know, I see a lot of clamor for vaccination as a response. And of course, it is an important response, but it's not going to have an immediate impact. We have to recognize that we are having a major wave right now, and the way to identify and spread, prevent the further spread is to try to identify these clusters early and identify those who are infected. One of the things that I worry about is I think there's still a reluctance to get tested. In fact, I've heard now from enough sources that there are families where one person gets tested and then they assume that the other individuals within the family are probably exposed if they have symptoms or not. So, I mean, people are just still not getting tested enough. So it would be good to use testing strategically, not to say that we just need to do indiscriminate testing, but it is certainly an important part of the response to be able to identify those who might be spreading.
The first week of the second wave, there was no change in the testing pattern until then. Okay. And as the numbers rose, we had to test more. So it is actually the other way around. The increasing numbers promoted increasing tests. And so I don't think that you cannot wish away the numbers because of the increased testing. Increased testing was a necessity, and it was stimulated by increasing numbers of infection.
There's a proper massive second wave.
Yes, yeah.
Dr. David, what's the role of biotech startup incubators? Because you mentioned it would be great if many countries develop their own vaccines. So we need to encourage the startup incubators. So how can we do that, and what's their role?
I think probably Dr. Ban could answer that better than I can. But what I will say is that the trend in the big industries today is to use these biotech incubators, these small companies, which are much leaner and meaner and less costly, to do the innovative research and development. And they partner then with the big companies to do the prototypes and the production and the manufacturing. So yes, governments that promote this type of biotech, the incubators, are governments that have been able to have greater innovation and greater ways forward, not only in medicine, but in many, many other fields as well. So I think government bureaucracy must understand that if they want innovators, they have to facilitate innovation by decreasing the bureaucracy necessary to get registered and to do the job in places that are already developing in India and in other parts of the world. So I think, yes, very important role. But I think, as I say, Dr. Ban might have a better view on what could be done in India than I.
Yeah, no, thanks, David. So maybe just to add on, I mean, there are good examples in India. In fact, DBT's, one of the outfits which came out of DBT is BIRAC, and BIRAC does support a lot of bio incubation. They've been consistently supporting that, and we've seen a lot of really interesting innovators come out of it. Many of them smaller in nature, small to mid-size, as David was talking about. The challenge, I think, is that there is a valley of death. There is often support at the early end, but the middle years can be the tough ones, and both financial support as well as support to take them through that process of good quality clinical trials, which can take a lot of time, require a lot of investment, is also something which requires more thinking and probably more support. And that I think we need to do more of. But there is certainly a lot of innovation happening in India, a lot of handholding happening, much better situation, I think, than a few years ago. But I think in areas such as vaccine development, because it sometimes takes so long, it can be difficult to see that kind of sustained support go through. So maybe that's another area where there could be more support from philanthropy, certainly from the government, but also ensuring that we leverage expertise available within the scientific community for that.
BIRAC is doing a good job in supporting the startups, but obviously we need much additional help from the government and funding to inspire our research. And COVID is a definite lesson for us. We learned a big lesson from the COVID. We need to invest more in our scientific research. No doubt. A very valid point. We have a lot of very specific, academic questions about which COVID vaccine is better than the other. I'm avoiding those questions because we have got a much important, a broader strategy to discuss. Any other points, Dr. John?
No, I don't have any. I'm not going to volunteer any new ideas. You raise questions and I'll answer them.
Anything our policy makers should do?
Yes, of course. Create a public health infrastructure. That will take care of a lot of issues. The startups, there is a supply-demand equation. If there is no demand at the other end, and you overproduce the small-scale innovative research, it will not go anywhere. India does not demand research results for making policy decisions. And if you don't, then people will not produce the results that research only can supply for shifting, for designing policy changes. So it's a supply-demand thing. I'm telling you from my personal experience of decades, there is no demand for research solutions for national policy level. Look at tuberculosis, for example. You know well about TB. So yes, supply demand is very, very important. Demand should be created, supply will automatically follow.
David, there's a question about the vaccine-induced prothrombotic thrombocytopenia, our VPIT. Should we really worry about it, how significant it is, and how is it going to affect our vaccination program?
Well, I think the precautions that countries are taking right now, first of all, to register the number of cases that are occurring in vaccinated people is very important. It's been very difficult to sort this out. In fact, it's still difficult because it's occurring many times in young women who might also be on oral contraceptives, which could be a precursor to thromboembolic disease. But in addition, there are some cases that might just be occurring iatrogenically in populations. And so it's been very difficult to sort this out. But I think now the general feeling is that this is a very rare side effect to the Oxford vaccine, but that the benefit of the vaccine greatly outweighs the risk, and that there is a way of dealing with this risk, because if people who are vaccinated do develop a severe headache in 1 or 2 days after the vaccination, if they immediately report to their health worker, this can be dealt with properly, and there's a way of treating the people who have this side effect. So I think, yes, there is concern, but the risk benefit is in favor of continuing vaccinations, but maybe limiting it to people who are elderly, who are older, maybe over 50, or maybe limiting it, not giving it to young women. It depends on what the government's evidence is. And I'm sure Jacob might know something about that in India. Jacob, yeah.
Yes, I have a question to you, Abdul. People between 30 and 60 years of age are the ones that you worry about. A suggestion has come up that if you do CRP, C-reactive protein, if it is elevated If it is elevated, then avoid the AstraZeneca vaccine. 30 to 60 age bracket and CRP as a testing tool. What do you think of it, Abdul?
So won't it be difficult to implement this on the ground? Testing
Yes.
CRP for all
Yes.
the vaccine candidates?
Only for AstraZeneca.
I mean,
That
all
is-
the individuals we are going to vaccinate for all the age between 30 and 60?
well, that may solve the problem.
Is
And
the
if you
evidence enough? It may not be impossible because we can have a rapid
Yeah.
CRP testing kit. That's not difficult. But is the evidence enough to implement this on the ground as a public health intervention?
I'm asking you.
Okay, so that's a switch that probably our COVID vaccination committee should look into it.
Exactly.
Okay, thanks, sir. We will communicate the message to the
Yeah,
committee.
we are here to solve problems.
Okay,
Therefore, it's a way I'm suggesting is a way out,
okay.
possibly.
Thanks, sir. David, I think we are running out of time. We had 1.5 hours of detailed discussions of the policy and the science of vaccination. I have one philosophical question to ask all of you. We had 2 meetings and we have completed 1 year of COVID pandemic. Do you think this world of science has become wiser or better after 1 year of the pandemic? Are we going to do better? David?
I think we've done very well in developing new tools to deal with infectious diseases, new vaccine platforms, and a whole series of other tools. And yes, those will remain. But the problem will be our governments, whether the understanding in our governments remains that they need to be doing much, much more, as Jacob said, in creating stronger, not only stronger public health, but stronger health promotion to make sure that we have healthier populations so they don't succumb to infections which are especially severe in that type of person. So we need to have a stronger health promotion activity, and we need to also make more resilient health systems. So we've got lots of things that we have to do in the future. Whether governments have learned from this pandemic, I think we can only hope they have, but I'm not so sure that the memory will be long lasting, unfortunately.
Dr. John, do you think this is the perfect time to convince our government for investing in public health? Will we succeed if we all work together and convince the policymakers to invest more in public health? Is it going to happen?
The timing is correct. Whether you succeed or not, I cannot predict. But let me tell you something. I teach MPH students, Master Public Health, in different places. I used to, I'm no longer. One of my first questions to the students, they are elite students, very brainy, coming from different backgrounds. I ask a question, some people fall ill, others don't. Maybe in the same community, same family. Why is that? God's punishment, 20% of people. Karma, 20% of people. Fate, predetermined, another 20% of people. So 60 out of 100, by and large, believe in this kind of causation of disease. Science will not grow in that milieu unless we think that physical world, physical diseases have physical causes and they follow the physical rules of cause and effect, and there are societal and environmental determinants of disease, etc., etc. I mean, it's a big I wouldn't say black box. It's a big box into which you have to brainwash these students who have reached up to MPH level, and they still think that we cannot actually influence the occurrence of diseases, or we cannot really prevent any diseases. It is God given, or it is nature given, it is inevitable. You cannot change that. That mindset has to be addressed.
We have to change the mindset that we can make a change. If
Yes, exactly.
So, yeah. So if you want to make a change, we have to have the mindset first. And Anand, what do you think? After Dr. Jacobs John's advice, do you think this is the perfect time to create that mindset, to create a change in our public health system?
Yeah, I think, one lesson certainly for all of us is also humility. I think, there have been a lot of hypotheses, many of us also, including me, some of our own understanding has repeatedly been questioned by this whole pandemic and our response. Anything from a special immunity that we might have, as when the cases started going down, there was this whole hypothesis that there is something around tropical immunity, etc., which might be at play. But clearly, this current wave has shown that we are as susceptible to a rise in infections again. So I think it just reinforces the importance of just good quality science, integrity, investment in that, and ensuring that we learn from that, and we take our political decisions, our policy decisions based on that learning. That there is a lot that we can draw from the experiences. But I worry as well, as David was saying, that the responses we've seen so far indicates that it's all short term, and they don't really have a medium to long term vision around how things can be changed. And that doesn't bode well for us as a country, or in fact, globally as well. That if we can't invest in building that scientific temper, as Professor John is saying, in investing in science, as Professor Heyman is saying, then, what have we learned from this? How are we going to protect ourselves from another pandemic? And many of these pandemics will unfortunately keep coming. And more importantly, how do we ensure that we build capacity that in our health system, in our scientific response, and build just a better understanding of science, so that we are able to better engage with it and learn from evidence in our responses. And if we do that, I think we'll just be in a much better place in the future. So hopefully, efforts like this and meetings like this will help raise those questions and make people think about why that is important.
Yes, thanks, Anand. It's very important that we keep on trying, and probably there's an opportunity to keep on trying further. It's been a wonderful discussion, and let's get opinion of our GCCMC organizer of this meeting, Dr. Seshadri.
Thank you. Thanks for this amazing meeting, and thanks for helping us take this message to everyone. And Abdul's been such a wonderful moderator. He's so committed to this whole thing, and it is also wonderful for us to hear the ethical aspects of each of these, the implications to public health, the directions for future. One of the things that we've been talking about in GCMC is to start, at least with the second wave, a couple of startup grants for people who are interested in exploring this further. And Abdul, we'll come back to you for your support in taking this forward. I want to close up with a comment and your frank opinion. There is a surfeit of literature on COVID-19 that has confused people more than it has helped. As pseudoscience become mainstream, I know Dr. Ban will have a view on this. And how do people like us who are not infectious disease specialists, I'm a lowly endocrinologist. How do we guard ourselves from the pseudoscience that has flooded the literature in terms of COVID-19? And also, can I also have your last words on what do you think is the future of publication and science with free access to literature and lack of peer review and all of these? How is COVID going to affect medicine of the future? Can I have one last round from all of you, and then and also very selfishly ask you if maybe in a month or will you be able to come back? Thank you. And then we will say thanks to everyone.
Thanks, Seshadri. You entered a very slippery slope, and we'll get the opinion of all our three experts. Dr. John, what do you think about the publications and the COVID? What's happening?
I let me say one thing. This is like we were traveling in a train and the train has stopped at a station because of COVID, and we need to continue when the COVID is over. Will we go the same track, the same way, same direction, or will we change the direction in another way? I am not so sure. When the nightmare of the pandemic is over, will we go back to our old ways, or will we change? Will science and human behavior, will they move in parallel, or will human behavior stay in the 20th century and science will move into 21st century? I have no way of predicting that, but I am worried.
Yeah. David, what do you think about it? A difficult question, I know.
Yeah, well, the science has really been incredible that's come available, and it's been published in front of paywalls by the medical journals. And it's been useful and it's been confusing at the same time. As Dr. Krishna said, it's been very confusing. I think what's the biggest challenge, though, is the fact that the response has many times been led by modelers who haven't had the benefit of good epidemiological information as they've done their modeling, and therefore their predictions have sometimes not been exactly on target. Early on, the modelers were using parameters that were from influenza, but it rapidly became clear that this didn't respond the same way as influenza. This did not go directly to communities. There was a stop-off in outbreaks, and you could stop those outbreaks, but the modelers hadn't taken that into consideration, and neither had national plans, which were influenza plans. And so as a result, the response was led by modelers who didn't have the right information at the start. And that was how science led the response early on. But after that, I think the world came together and really has done a very good job in sorting out what's right from what's wrong in science through rapid peer review and through publishing some literature on a non-peer reviewed site where people can get it, understanding that the real literature is in the peer review. So I think we've seen a flourishing of research money, and I hope that continues. But I hope it's used properly as well, and the evidence will speak for itself as time goes on.
Dr. Bhan?
Yeah, it's certainly a major issue. I mean, I think there's been a lot of very good quality science and good quality research, including support for that. There's also been a lot of a surfeit of misinformation, including on social media, and that by itself is an infodemic certainly to talk about. Again, I think it just shows the importance of something which Professor John was talking about, that do we have enough scientific literacy? Are our medical professionals, are our public health professionals, are our policymakers, do they understand the basics of even reading a paper, understanding and evaluating evidence before making judgment on it? Or do they just buy anything at face value? So do we know how to critically read a finding? And if that is not taught in our public health schools, in our medical schools, in our nursing schools, then isn't that a problem? That just because someone makes a claim, that if you just buy it at just at that, that by itself is an issue. So I think we all need to be more skeptical, and by being more skeptical, we become better scientists. It's not to discredit or not to criticize, but by actually being by being critical of any claims. By wanting to look at evidence, we are trying to improve the quality of science, which is happening, including in our own countries. Many of us who raise questions are sometimes tagged as being anti-nationalists, but it's not. It's actually the opposite. We want good quality science, and we want more of that to happen in our own countries. But if we don't ask those questions, I think that by itself is being anti-national. You're not supporting the cause of science in your own country. So I think we want to be, if that is what is being anti-national, then let's be more anti-national by pushing more science and hopefully making things improve for everyone.
Thank you. I think, all of us wear our nations on our sleeve, and, Dr. Gaffoor, I will leave you to summarize and close, because, and, once again, thank you for such a passionate discussion, and, I hope that we can continue to engage in this kind of discussion in the future. I know I'm imposing on you gentlemen, but you are our hope to see some clarity in science.
As a moderator, I have been so lucky because I could ask not only scientific questions, but philosophical questions. Because three panelists are not only well-known scientists in their field, their wealth of experience have made them philosophers. And that's very important to guide the youngsters. And thank you very much. We will persuade our very busy panelists to meet again, probably after 2 months. I'm hopeful they will agree. Let's hope for the best. Thanks a lot, Dr. John, Dr. David, and Dr. Ban. Thanks a lot for participating in this panel discussion. And thanks GCCMC for organizing this meeting. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Stay safe. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Krishna. Thank you very much. Gafur, that was good. Thank you, Gafur.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Muruganathan.
Yeah, thanks, sir.